On March 25, 1945, an immense fleet of American warships closed on Okinawa, the largest pendant in the chain of Ryukyu Islands, which arcs gently toward Formosa from the Japanese homeland. The following day, hundreds of those ships began a final week of bombardment before invading the home of the once independent Okinawan dynasty. 3 days later, Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, Emperor Hirohito's advisor on naval affairs, had an audience with the nearsighted monarch in Tokyo, some 900 miles northeast. His Majesty, deeply concerned, was eager to ensure his military leaders were ignoring no opportunity. The meeting took place in the Imperial Palace, which lay in the center of Tokyo and at the heart of national beliefs. American pilots had been ordered to spare the serene grounds that occupied almost a square mile of the overcrowded city. Elsewhere, the bombing was less intense than in previous weeks, only because so much of the capital had already been leveled. Air raid sirens were again wailing when Oikawa was driven through the imperial gates, and distant Okinawa was being pounded by wave after wave of planes from the American Armada's carriers, in addition to its heavy guns. Waiting with members of his staff in a damp bomb shelter near the Imperial Library, the harried admiral tried to think how best to brief the emperor about current operations. Although Oikawa was the Imperial Navy's chief of staff as well as the emperor's advisor, he was less than well informed. Intense rivalry with the commanders of the combined fleet kept him at arm's length from the vital decisions about operations. Imperial advisors now had an impossible task in any case. The Pacific War could no more be stopped than won. No one could acknowledge that the end was in sight, because the only possible end was the oblivion toward which the country was marching in lockstep. The officers bowed deeply when the emperor appeared, then seated themselves at a conference table. Hollywood would not have cast His Majesty for the role. Even in his field marshal's uniform, the middle-aged guy with glasses, as a student of the period recently described the slight figure, looked more the shy academic than a belligerent empire's ceremonial leader. But Hirohito's people revered him as a direct descendant of the sun goddess, and Oikawa and his staff sat sideways in order to avert their gaze when they took their places at the table. Few Japanese permitted themselves a direct glance at the divine presence, let alone an opinion about his appearance. If Hirohito had had the power to stop the war now, he may have considered it, not because he felt it had been wrong from the start, but because it had taken such terrible turns. His Majesty hadn't always been the disapproving spectator of Japan's military adventures that the American occupation would pretend after the surrender. Never having seen anything shameful in the attack on Pearl Harbor, he relished victory even more than his cooks and his gardeners did, especially after the Pacific War began, as well as it did for Japan. Nor was he as powerless or innocent as his post-war defenders would claim. On the contrary, he often studied battle plans attentively, sometimes making proposals for stronger action, or asking questions that were interpreted as suggestions for altering tactics. That was particularly relevant to thousands of sailors now, for his questions to Oikawa were about to doom them. The admiral's focus on preparations for Okinawa's defense was inescapable. If the enemy succeeded in landing troops there, the war would enter a stage of almost inconceivable menace. The island was a mere 350 miles from the southern tip of Kyushu, the southernmost of the 4 major Japanese home islands, and it was not an occupied territory but a sliver of the motherland, at least as a colour on the map. The Ryukyus were one of the 47 Japanese prefectures. The emperor also worried that if the forthcoming battle there were lost, the army and navy will lose the trust of the nation. Against those terrible threats, the need for what was called special measures was clear. The chief of staff informed the emperor about provisions for kamikaze operations, which had already begun against the American fleet carrying out the pre-invasion bombardment. The emperor urged him to leave nothing to be desired in executing those plans, with a hard struggle by all our forces, since they will decide the fate of our empire. But Oikawa's assurance that 2,000 planes were available for the kamikaze attacks troubled Hirohito. "Was that all?" he asked in his reedy voice. The admiral's hasty reply that the army would contribute an additional 1,500 aircraft did not satisfy. "But where is the navy?" His Majesty asked, his tone putting an edge to the question. "Are there no more ships? No surface forces?" That sealed the fate of the Imperial Navy's Yamato, the world's biggest and best battleship. Horror of loss of face would grip combined fleet headquarters when they learned of the Emperor's query about why nothing had been planned for the surface ships. The same need to save face, in a war in defense of honor rather than of military advantage or territory, would cause much of the terrible waste at Okinawa. To the destruction would now be added a squadron of the last remaining operational warships, which combined fleet headquarters quickly undertook to send there. A joyfully triumphant beginning made the war's current bleakness doubly difficult to accept. Few Japanese generals and fewer admirals had believed total victory could be won in a long struggle with America, but many had hoped swift, stinging blows would persuade Washington to permit Japan to pursue her interests in the Pacific rather than subject the American people to the hardships of war. The attack on Pearl Harbor that delivered the first one in December 1941 appeared successful beyond its proponents' wildest dreams. American brass, including the self-congratulating General Douglas MacArthur, had been almost unanimous in doubting that a nation inferior in every way their perceptions registered would contemplate risking such an utterly stupid and almost fantastic venture, which could only end in her own speedy destruction. "When the Japanese come down here," an Associated Press correspondent allowed, conveying the pre-war self-assurance of the American garrison in the Philippines, "they'll be playing in the big leagues for the first time in their lives." That was shortly before the brilliantly daring raid, that Sunday morning of December 7th on the major U.S. naval base near Honolulu. Japanese planes killed and wounded 4,000 Americans while sinking or severely disabling 5 of the 8 battleships nestled in Battleship Row. It would later become common coinage that the tactical masterstroke at Pearl Harbor was a great strategic blunder because it shook Americans from their pacifist isolationism. Hitler had invaded Poland 2 years earlier and now occupied most of Europe, and united them in hot resolve for vengeance. But at the time, virtually every American saw the almost instant destruction of so much of the Pacific Fleet as a national calamity rather than a Japanese mistake. The near panic it prompted revealed more about America's susceptibility to paranoia than about the actual military situation, which, however, was gloomy in the short run. The spectacular strikes and lightning landings that followed Pearl Harbor stunned Americans with disaster after disaster. In 3 months, Japan took vast areas of the Pacific by seizing island, territories equivalent in size to half the United States. Her conquests soon extended to a near circle with a diameter of 2,800 miles, from Manchuria to China to Burma to the Dutch East Indies to New Guinea to 500 miles west of Hawaii to the Bering Sea. Americans were particularly shocked by the fall of the Philippines despite her venerable U.S. garrison. The citadel of Corregidor, its fortifications protected by prodigious concrete, had been thought unconquerable. But nothing stopped the enduring, thirsting Japanese. Their men were tougher and better trained. Many of their weapons were superior. The supposedly Japanese had better binoculars, rangefinders and illumination devices, faster planes, and much more effective torpedoes. Their crack ships, relentlessly drilled under the most demanding conditions, were unequalled in seamanship and firepower. Their carrier pilots were the world's best. But the loss of great numbers of those pilots at the crucial Battle of Midway in June 1942 began turning the tide. Midway told virtually every Japanese admiral that the huge gamble of hard punches to persuade America to negotiate rather than fight was lost, for the Pearl Harbor strike had prompted a psychological effect opposite to the one intended. Instead of discouraging a people softened by democracy and luxury from shouldering the burdens of all-out war, it jolted the world's greatest economic power, whose industrial capacity was roughly 10 times greater than Japan's, into unprecedented industrial and military action. Little could have better kindled righteous American wrath than the shock of the sneak attack, as generations would know it. even after America began making her own such strikes against feeble states such as Grenada and Panama. However, the Midway victory brought little relief to the Americans fighting in the Pacific, for whom the next 33 months might have been 3 decades. A succession of struggles, each more fierce than the last, was required to retake Japanese-captured territory. The Solomon Islands, Gilbert Islands, Mariana Islands, Bonin Islands. The names evoke images of supremely ferocious combat in atrocious conditions. Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Peleliu, Guam, Tinian, Saipan. Not every island and atoll was host to progressively greater savagery, but the trend was clear. The nearer the site to the sacred Japanese homeland, the greater the resistance and blood. The first 6 days of fighting on Iwo Jima, about 700 miles south of Tokyo Bay, produced 10 times the expected number of casualties. The total reached nearly 26,000 Americans, most in their teens and early 20s, before some 250 Japanese launched a final kamikaze attack on the same March 26, 1945, when the American warships began their final pre-invasion bombardment of Okinawa. It was time, as it had been for at least 2 savage years, for Tokyo to plan capitulation. But no matter how clear that was to Allied observers, the realization and logic were apparent to few Japanese. Their defense of honor, more important than the defense of any military position, could not be abandoned until many more could die suitably. Admission of defeat was so inconceivable to the military commanders who ruled the country that Admiral Oikawa wouldn't think of mentioning it to his emperor that March 29th, although the clearly futile defense of Okinawa the two discussed would almost inevitably be far costlier than all previous island bloodbaths. American troops headed there rhymed the Golden Gate in 48, meaning they feared Japan's full defeat and their homecoming might take 3 more years. Although Okinawa would be the beginning of the end, the lost war was far from over for Japan, and thus for the Allies. Yamato wasn't merely the mightiest engine of destruction afloat, as the U.S. Naval Institute would call her. The masterpiece of naval design and construction was also a symbol and a legend, a source of immense pride for the Japanese people. Her supremely graceful profile belied her size. Even the most recently commissioned American battle wagons of the Iowa class looked bulky by comparison. A sweeping foredeck made Yamato a marine greyhound, eager to leap upon the enemy, and able to, thanks to an innovative hull shape that helped boost her speed well above what was expected from a ship of her size and firepower. 12 engine and boiler rooms discharged their exhaust through a single funnel that swept back at a rakish 25-degree angle. With her teak weather deck unbroken from streamlined stem to stern, a distance almost the length of 3 football fields, she was a singularly elegant structure, and the crew's quarters on Hotel Yamato, as lesser ships' envious sailors nicknamed her, were positively indulgent by Japanese standards. She even had revolutionary air conditioning in many compartments, an extraordinary luxury in a navy that valued difficult conditions for the nourishment of the commitment to self-sacrifice inherent in Yamato Damashi, the Japanese fighting spirit. More to the point, she was not only one of the most intelligent and efficient capital ships ever built, but also the most powerful and most heavily armoured, fully 40% larger than the 4 ships of the same Great Iowa class. With main armour of 16 inches and protection of vital parts such as magazines by belts up to 2 feet thick, she was built to withstand the heaviest American naval shells and 1,000-pound bombs dropped from 11,000 feet. Her own main armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, compared to 16 inches on the Iowa-class wagons. They fired shells of 3,220 pounds, 30% heavier than America's new 16 inches, a distance of nearly 30 miles, which meant the ship could hit the most powerful enemy vessels well before they could try to close within their range of her. Since heavier guns virtually guaranteed victory in surface battles with lesser ships, peerless Yamato seemed certain to destroy the best American battleship, even small groups of them, if she encountered them without carriers. Her armour and ingenious damage control dispositions throughout her 5 decks made her nearly unbeatable and unsinkable by most surface opposition. It said much about national priorities that such a superb vessel, with her enormous consumption of resources, including enough steel for a railroad line between Tokyo and Osaka, 250 miles apart, had been built at a time when the majority of Japanese panted to feed themselves. Only fierce ambition, matching sacrifice, and impassioned science permitted such a colossal construction project of such advanced conception, with dozens of major design and engineering triumphs and hundreds of components on the leading edge of naval technology, to be launched on such a relatively thin industrial base. Yamato's keel had been laid in 1937, when Japanese military spending consumed 70% of government expenditure. The dry dock was heavily screened by bamboo matting to keep her existence secret. She and a sister ship called Musashi, begun a year later, were to be the ace in the hole in a war with America, which, the Imperial Navy believed, wouldn't build battleships too large to use the Panama Canal. American bombs had sunk Musashi in October 1944, 5 months before the Emperor's fatal questions to Admiral Oikawa. The following month, American torpedoes sank giant Shinano, laid down in 1939 and later recommissioned as an aircraft carrier. The submarine that made that extraordinary kill had taken time off from her lifeguard patrol for downed B-29 SE because no air raids on the Japanese mainland were scheduled that night. 6 torpedoes hit the converted supercarrier as she was on her way in internal waters to the great naval port of Kure. But the first of her class was intact and fit. It didn't matter to most Japanese that was because she'd so far done little fighting. What everyone could see was that the Imperial Japanese Navy's only surviving operational battleship remained silvery and spotless. Yamato was its lucky ship, a survivor of the Battle of the Philippine Sea as well as Midway, and the only one to emerge from Leyte Gulf with only 2 insignificant bomb hits. It seemed even more natural that she remained magnificent even at that hopeless stage of the war, for she bore the national name. The Japanese often called themselves the Yamato people, after the ancient kingdom on the Yamato Plain on Honshu, the largest mainland island. Thus the poetic, evocative synonym for Japan rang with symbolic significance, the very kind that sustained the Japanese people as the war turned toward disaster. The pride of the fleet was thought to have a special mission. Her narrower one that first week of April, the planned foray to Okinawa, was supremely hazardous. For despite Yamato's crushing power, she was on her way toward obsolescence the moment she was quietly commissioned, several days after Pearl Harbor, which ironically ended the battleship's reign as the king of naval power. The attack's triumph forever laid to rest the notion that surface ships would fight it out for control of the Pacific, with victory going to the behemoths with the biggest guns and toughest armor. One of the old campaigners who best knew that was the Japanese Nelson, who'd planned the tactically and technically masterful Pearl Harbor strike. Isoroku Yamamoto was also called the Reluctant Admiral because he'd long opposed war against the United States. "Do not uncover the teapot and release a typhoon," he warned when a staff officer first suggested the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto also vigorously opposed the building of the super battleships. Asked how aircraft could possibly sink the new Titans with their prodigious anti-aircraft armament, he replied prophetically that the fiercest serpent can be overcome by a swarm of ants, just as the Pacific War would repeatedly confirm. As much as Yamato's officers loved her, numerous sinkings of great capital ships by planes since 1941 led some to classify the vessel with the Great Wall of China and the pyramids as the world's 3 great follies, prize examples of uselessness. Japanese admirals knew the new dominance of air power better than anyone. One of the most prominent was Minister of the Navy Mitsumasa Yonai, who was among the minority of senior admirals who had tried to avert war with America. Now Yonai regretted that the skeptics had allowed themselves to be convinced, against their better judgment, that quick, smashing defeats would persuade comfort-loving Americans not to make the sacrifices required for a lengthy struggle. The minister had become so appalled by the course of the war and his own complicity in extending it to America that he, a former prime minister, was holding secret talks in fear for his life, with a few like-minded officers who hoped against hope to find a way to end hostilities. Yonai was now less concerned with the debate over plans for Yamato than with trying to replace the present prime minister with someone who would permit a more open pursuit of peace. He felt obliged to work for the survival of Japan herself, not the fate of just one battleship, or even of a fleet. Still, he leaned against Yamato's mission to Okinawa because it would be useless, even harmful to the existence of the country as a whole. The Navy's senior staff cleaved into factions. Many knew as well as Yonai that the war was lost, but were afraid to say so. Others yearned for immediate action no matter what the odds or consequences. Better that the remnants of the fleet make a glorious final charge than they be sunk at their moorings by carrier-based American planes now hitting homeland bases, with the insufferable humiliation to naval and national self-respect. Although the proportion of mystical firebrands was distinctly smaller than in the army, they used the same kinds of emotional appeal to honour and glory, to the Japanese spirit, and to obligations to the emperor. Even if the odds were only 10% in favour, the effort would be worthwhile, argued Captain Shigenori Kami, the combined fleet's chief of operations. A true samurai doesn't ask whether his efforts pay. He merely seeks the opportunity to sacrifice himself. Much lower in the command chain, the skipper of Yahagi, a light cruiser that would anchor Yamato's screen, disagreed. Captain Tameichi Hara, one of the distinguished fighting officers who went against the grain of that Japanese appeal for sacrifice and more sacrifice, pointedly told his men that they should not hesitate to return alive. "Our mission appears suicidal, and it is," Hara addressed his crew. "But I wish to emphasize that kamikaze is not the objective. You are not to be slain merely as sacrifices for the nation." That opinion had to be ventured said a good deal about the grip on the country by those who preached the value of precisely such sacrifices. "If the ship should be damaged or sunk, don't hesitate to save yourself," went Hara's key order, which he himself would follow in a rare reversal of the canon that Japanese commanding officers must go down with their ships. Other skippers argued that the overriding consideration was the simple duty to fight. The Navy's commander-in-chief was swayed by one argument, then another. Of course, the Imperial Navy must not lose more face, but which alternative offered more certainty of that? This time, the combined fleet staff did not ignore Naval Chief of Staff Oikawa. They interpreted the Emperor's questions to him as a reproach. It would have been impossible for the Navy not to carry out what His Majesty appeared to have suggested with characteristic Japanese indirectness, that surface ships must join the sacrifice of the kamikaze pilots. Even to admit to him the tiny number of fighting ships left would have been an intolerable loss of face. It would be an exaggeration to say that at this stage of the war, the entire Yamato nation was preparing to do what Yamato had been ordered to at Okinawa, or that the same obligation to make the ultimate sacrifice would be expected of the Japanese people as a whole when the home islands were invaded. But the parallels were strong. When nothing was left but a supreme gesture of sacrificial defiance against an overwhelming force, that gesture had to be made. As a senior officer on one of Yamato's escort ships remembered it, Hirohito's questions implied essentially this: "Others are dying. Kamikaze pilots are dying gloriously. Why are you doing nothing? You too should die." When reports of the Imperial briefing reached the combined fleet staff later the same day, the debate was resolved. Operation 10 Ichigo, Heaven No. 1, was assured, and Yamato was as good as sunk. Another circumstance helped explain the naval chief's urge to act, even at the certain cost of the Navy's last and finest jewel. The destruction of Japan's major cities distressed them even more than the enemy's imminent landing on Okinawa. Operating from new bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, those islands of the earlier bloodbaths, state-of-the-art American aircraft were virtually erasing urban targets. Night after night, the industrial centers and their civilian populations were being blasted by hundreds of B-29S loaded to their unprecedented limits with high-explosive and incendiary bombs. The awe-inspiring superfortresses were commanded by Major General Curtis LeMay, father of the new strategy of saturation bombing. LeMay, who'd arrived from Europe in January to take over the 21st Bomber Command, promised to beat Japan back into the Dark Ages. The shift from precision bombing of strategic sites to the destruction of entire cities led a Yokohama observer to report that looting presented no problem after a raid because nothing was left but rubble. Tokyo's biggest turn had come 3 weeks before Oikawa's briefing of the Emperor, while American landing forces for Okinawa were en route on troopships or being assembled on staging islands. During the night of March 9-10, 334 warplanes incinerated the capital's central districts, with 10 times the tonnage of the Luftwaffe bombs that had caused the Great Fire of London in September 1940. Tokyo's Great Fire Raid, as it became known in turn, roasted residents on the streets and in their homes as if entire city blocks had been shoveled into ovens. The horror in those congested 16 square miles of wood and bamboo was unequalled anywhere on the home islands. By the count of the charred corpses, even the forthcoming atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be lesser events. Measured by numbers of torturous deaths or decibels of human pain, that tragedy would be exceeded only by what awaited the Okinawan people. That night's strong wind whipped the flames of American incendiary bombs into a wall of fire roiling hundreds of feet in the air. 250,000 buildings were consumed. Before daylight, nearly a fifth of Tokyo's industrial areas and 63% of its commercial districts had disappeared. The heat ignited hordes at a distance, people running from the flames as fast as they could burst into balls of fire. Others jumped into canals for salvation and were boiled alive there. It was probably the greatest one-night disaster, with the largest sum of suffering endured by any city in world history. When senior naval personnel debated the pros and cons of Yamato's sortie 3 weeks later, the Navy Ministry's windows remained caked in black from the smoke, and volunteers were cremating the last piles of carbonized corpses. Kure, on the inland sea about 2/3 of the way from Tokyo to mainland Japan's southernmost city of Kagoshima, and about 20 miles from Hiroshima, had so far been spared major devastation, although it was home to Japan's largest naval base, including the yard where Yamato had been launched 3 years earlier. Kure's turn for destruction would come 6 weeks later, during the battle for Okinawa's Sugarloaf Hill. Meanwhile, its food rations were approaching the starvation level, and cadets at the Naval Academy on the tiny island of Eta facing the port were jokingly dubbed moles because they were too busy digging caves and tunnels for refuge from the awaited bombing to learn much seamanship. While the enemy fleet's last pre-invasion salvos were pounding Okinawa, Yamato was awaiting routine repairs in Kure. Moored to an outer buoy, the great ship seemed to a 22-year-old ensign named Mitsuru Yoshida, like a gigantic rock commanding all around her. Within hours of the American landing on Okinawa, some 600 miles south, the rock was ordered underway. A detailed chart of Okinawan waters on the chart table showed an arc representing the range of Yamato's big guns to the landing beaches. She didn't sail directly there, however, but to a safer anchorage behind an island some 15 miles from Hiroshima, while the plans for her sortie were made. Combined Fleet Headquarters' order to launch her unique operation came in Fleet Signal 607 to Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commander of Task Force 2, as the 2nd Fleet Battle Group to be led by Yamato had been designated. Ito, a graduate student at Yale in the late 1920s, had opposed the mission from the start, certain that it held no hope without air cover. Although Combined Fleet Headquarters had stopped communicating with its 2nd Fleet, perhaps out of embarrassment, it sent its Chief of Staff, Ito's classmate and close friend at the Naval Academy, to fly in to reassure him. Since no naval or military argument could accomplish that, the classmate used moral suasion. Task Force 2 was being requested to die gloriously, heralding the death of all Japanese who preferred that to surrender. Sooner or later, it will come to a special attack by the entire nation, the 100 million of us. Ito was asked to die admirably as a model for the 100 million. The Admiral agreed, but not all his captains did when summoned to a conference. After sometimes heated hours of discussion, the commander of the single cruiser among Yamato's escorts, told his crew they were participating in a kamikaze mission pure and simple. But unlike those our Air Force is carrying out, the kamikazes, ours hasn't got the slightest chance of destroying an important target. The admiral in command of the entire 9-ship screen, that light cruiser plus 8 destroyers, protested that, without air protection, we'll needlessly sacrifice the lives of 5,000 sailors. I'd gladly die at this very moment if I thought my death would help save our honourable homeland. But the screening ship's officers believe they can accomplish more if allowed to go out alone as raiders to attack American ships. I agree with them. This isn't even a kamikaze mission, the admiral in command of the squadron of the 8 destroyers would add several days later, since that implies the chance of chalking up a worthy target. But in the end, Task Force Commander Ito broke a long silence at the conference by reflecting that all were being given an appropriate opportunity to perform their highest duty. "A samurai lives so that he is always prepared to die," he said. That unchallengeable declaration, although it skirted the salient question of whether that was the best time to die, ended the argument at the command level. "Orders are orders," a captain observed. "We must make the best of the situation." As for Yamato's officers, many were also aware, even while hoping otherwise, that the mission could only be a suicidal display of useless courage. Few knew precisely that there were 15 American fleet carriers in Okinawan waters, plus a dozen smaller escort carriers, and the help, if needed, of 5 more of the Royal Navy's best, which were operating nearby. But even a majority of the junior officers recognized the foray as an exercise in fantasy. With a casualty rate of over 90% among Naval Academy graduates, they accepted that little life remained for them too. It wasn't going to their deaths, but going pointlessly, that disturbed some of them. They wanted to die in a battle that might inflict damage on the enemy. American air reconnaissance, they said in confidence among themselves, was too thorough for the ship to avoid being detected far before her surface guns were in range to fire a single shot. And once she was spotted, American air power was too overwhelming, just as American submarines had become too prevalent and efficient for her to escape destruction. Which country showed the world what airplanes could do by sinking the Prince of Wales? An ironic voice asked. And even if Yamato did manage to reach Okinawa, so many enemy battleships and heavy cruisers would be waiting for her that she'd have no hope against their combined might. Against that, the chief argument remained what it had been at higher levels: the duty, glory, and joy of dying for emperor and country. At least one officer said aloud that their deaths would find purpose by contributing to defeat rather than victory. How else can Japan be saved except by losing and coming to its senses? We'll die as harbingers of Japan's new life. That's where our real salvation lies, doesn't it? But the expedition's operational plan was of course rooted in quite different notions, even if it was uncharacteristically ambiguous for Japanese practice. Task Force 2's primary task was to serve as a decoy for weakening enemy defences against a forthcoming mass kamikaze attack by luring away American carrier-based interceptors. The ships were to survive as long as possible and shoot down as many enemy planes as possible, after which any that managed to reach Okinawa were to charge a large enemy anchorage offshore at daybreak on April 8th. Yamato's huge guns would devastate enemy naval and shore targets, perhaps sinking enough transports and causing enough shock to force an American withdrawal from the island. Finally, the ship would beach herself and continue firing until all ammunition was expended, whereupon surviving crew members would disembark to fight on land. During the ceremonial drinking of sake the evening before the sailing, the ship seemed overwhelmed by the immensity of her mission and possible tragedy. The men performed their roles like actors trapped in a morality play. A young ensign at one of the solemnly gay drinking jamborees dropped a glass raised to toast their departure, an unlucky omen in Japanese tradition. It shattered on the deck. But there was also radiance in the ship's various divisions. Some young officers affectionately patted the bald head of Captain Kosaku Ariga, one of the Navy's most courageous and popular senior officers, who joined the fun instead of punishing that exceedingly uncommon display of liberty. Love for the captain and for his legendary bravery and skill filled every heart. There were tumultuous cheers for him and for the treasured ship, which, with her 9 escorts, got under way the following afternoon, vow to die for the Emperor, chalked on a blackboard behind a main turret. April 6th was a glorious spring day on the calm inland sea. His previous disapproval of the kamikaze in the past, Tamechi Hara, the captain of the light cruiser, now felt, "This beautiful homeland is worthy of our sacrifices." All hands assembled on the foredeck for the executive officer's reading of a farewell message from the combined fleet's commander-in-chief. They again heard the task force identified as special, meaning essentially suicidal, and the attack described as unparalleled in its heroic bravery. An urging to exalt the glorious tradition of the Imperial Navy's surface forces was intended to uplift spirits, and did. When the executive officer read, "The fate of the Empire truly rests on this one action," all instantly recognized the echo of Admiral Heichachiro Togo's almost identical exhortation to obliterate the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, which was indeed accomplished. That encouragement had been repeated often enough in the present war, including by Admiral Yamamoto to the attack planes about to take off for Pearl Harbor, to have become a cliché. But despite the almost pathetic note in evoking those glorious moments to a fleet steaming to certain annihilation, the celebrated words boosted spirits all the same. After all, stunning victories by naval forces had swung the balance for Japan in the past. Fight gloriously to the death and completely destroy the enemy fleet. Render this operation the turning point of the war. The crew bowed in the direction of the Emperor, sang the national anthem, and shouted "Banzai" 3 times. The assistant radar officer, 22-year-old Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, was deeply moved, although he had no illusions about victory. The incomparable vessel on course for her sacred mission seemed the very soul of eternal, exalted Japan. Eyes watered and spines tingled, as if the entire nation, present and past, were a military band playing a send-off march. "Do a good job," officers encouraged. "Die a death worthy of you." Okinawa was 600 miles away. The Japanese public, when they finally learned of the mission's outcome, would long believe Yamato sailed with too little fuel for a round trip, especially after the seeming confirmation by the 2,000 tons of bunker oil noted in the official departure report. But young officers on the combined fleet staff could not leave the world's best ship with no chance to return. They knew the staggering odds as well as anyone. If the ship did have the inconceivably good luck to reach Okinawa undetected, she'd have a fighting chance against any 2, possibly even 3 or 4 American battleships and cruisers, but none against the dozen or more that would engage her, and that wasn't counting the enemy carriers and their planes, the critical factor in every major engagement at sea. Still, the junior officers rushed around Kura, frantically securing more precious fuel from overlooked storage places and ships not participating in the mission. Contrary to accounts by Japanese admirals and Western historians, Yamato's bunkers held more than enough to bring her back to her base. Now, steaming outward, Her Majesty continued making it emotionally unthinkable that she would do otherwise. Thanks to her incomparable seaworthiness, Ensign Yoshida recorded about the first hours underway, there is no pitch or roll. Even on the bridge we have the illusion of standing on firm ground. Yet the sea was deadly. With Yamato in the centre and the cruiser Yahagi bringing up the rear, the force deployed in a formation for night sailing under threat of submarine attack. Although the Bungo Strait, which it entered from the inland sea, was part of what American submariners had dubbed the Hit Parade waters, that narrow passage had to be run because B-29S had just remined safer straits east and west. The beautiful spring day was ending in glorious twilight. Sailors gazed at early cherry blossoms, ancient symbol of Japanese purity and evanescence, modern symbol of kamikaze volunteers. Lovingly observing Kyushu a few miles to starboard and Shikoku a few miles to port, The crew tried not to think that this was their last sight of the home islands, and to forget that the enemy that controls the sky controls the sea. He also controlled the radio waves. During the previous week, an American cryptanalysis center in Pearl Harbor had been working hard on Secret Fleet Signal 607 and the accompanying flurry of intercepted radio messages. Intelligence analysts had put together an accurate summary of Task Group 2's composition and intentions even before it set sail, and Yamato got no farther than the Bungo Strait before the first American sightings were made. In the late afternoon of April 6th, Hackleback and Threadfin, two submarines patrolling for the Japanese group, radioed an accurate description of it to Task Force 58, the American strike force at sea in the area. Trailing the formation by 5 miles, the submarines watched in fascination. The contact reports of American planes that took over the surveillance the following morning, a minute-by-minute record of the force's position, course and speed, were monitored by Yamato's radio personnel, but the captain could do nothing about them short of turning back. Hours after sailing, the great ship was doomed. The men who manned their watches on the bridge that night worked with quiet intensity, the highest-ranking officers distinguished by fluorescent initials on their caps. Just before midnight, Ensign Yoshida climbed a ladder to the bridge for lookout duty. Facing his home in Tokyo, he bowed and said a brief prayer. Task Force 58 was roughly 100 miles northeast of Okinawa when the submarine reports told it what it had been waiting to hear. A search plane from the carrier Essex found the Yamato group at dawn the following morning. From then on, it was relentlessly shadowed by aircraft flying just out of range of Japanese anti-aircraft armament, among them flying boats based at Karama-Reto, an island group 15 miles west of Okinawa that Americans had taken a few days before landing on Okinawa itself. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, had intended to give his battleships first crack at the Yamato as a kind of combat training. Adrenaline surged through the American crews when Spruance signalled them to prepare for a battle of behemoths that would surely be the war's last major surface action. But Task Force 58's Vice Admiral, Mark Mitcher, wanted to show that his planes could sink the world's most powerful ship, and Spruance yielded to his subordinate in direct command of the fighting unit. Mitcher ordered Task Force 58's 4 groups into launching positions. Reconnaissance planes from no less than a dozen carriers stalked Yamato while their strike craft were readied. In the unlikely event that those carriers and their escort of 8 battleships and a dozen heavy cruisers would be unable to deal with the vastly weaker enemy group, older ships from the flotilla bombarding Okinawa also made ready to engage. 6 battleships, of the 10 in the shore bombardment force, 7 cruisers and 21 destroyers. 90 minutes after the sighting of Yamato from the air, the task groups began launching their strikes from near Okinawa. The first main attack of 280 planes included dive bombers with 1,000 and 500-pound bombs and torpedo bombers with the latest torpedoes. The flying boats, which had been shadowing the prey from a protecting overcast, guided them to their target, now just over halfway to Okinawa. On board Yamato, there was some relief that the force had come so far without damage, despite the enemy search planes that were known to be plotting its position minute by minute. At noon, in the open waters of the East China Sea, a smiling force commander expressed confidence that all had gone well on the morning watch, even though a radio report from a lookout on a Ryukyuan island north of Okinawa had announced that an estimated 250 enemy planes were headed in his direction. Half an hour later, a new radar contact was made, and a hoarse voice reported the approaching aircraft's direction and range. The warning was so similar to hundreds of shipboard drills that the crew found it hard to accept as real, but the tension quickly surged as lookouts strained to see the enemy. At last 2 Grummons were spotted, then 5, then 30. Yamato's huge number of anti-aircraft guns had been bolstered by even more before she sailed. On Captain Ariga's order, 6 6-inch secondary batteries, 24 5-inch anti-aircraft, and 150 machine guns commenced firing at the same instant, joined by the escorting destroyer's main and secondary batteries. The roar was as terrible as the sight of so many hostile planes. No other Japanese force could come close to putting up so much flak. But although Yamato's main batteries had once shot down an entire 10-plane formation, the force now faced far too many planes piloted by men with too much talent. A bomb hit one of the destroyers almost immediately. She exposed her crimson underbelly, lifted her stern into the air, and sank in less than a minute, leaving a few dozen survivors. And despite the black curtain of shell bursts and shrapnel from Yamato, despite desperate evasive maneuvers with her 150 000 horsepower engines straining mightily at full throttle, 2 Curtiss Helldivers penetrated the curtain. In minutes, they hit the ship with 2 bombs near the aft tower, destroying one of her radar rooms. 4 minutes later, a torpedo bomber scored a hit on the port bow. A hot fragment killed a sailor near Ensign Yoshida. Through the deafening din of the explosions and anti-aircraft fire, he heard the dull thud of his skull striking against the bulkhead and sniffed fresh blood in the pall of smoke rising from the hits. After the first strike broke off, the Chief of Staff speculated that pilots of such fearless skill in bearing down to bomb and torpedo in the face of the ship's great anti-aircraft fire must be of the enemy elite. But during the ensuing lull, some sailors assured themselves they'd survived the worst. The enemy carriers had surely exhausted themselves. Knowing a single torpedo couldn't seriously damage the great ship, her officers tried to make light of the hit. As medical corpsmen removed the body of a sailor from the bridge, Captain Arriga comforted the others. "We're still afloat and still fighting," the famous veteran declared. The second wave, which arrived less than an hour after the first, had so many planes that a gunner likened the little spots under the clouds to sesame seeds. Bullets and shrapnel flew as thick as buckshot. 3 sailors toppled simultaneously on young Yoshida. A fellow ensign tried to rise and bandage his thigh with a blood-soaked towel. As he was placed on a stretcher, he turned pale, smiled slightly, and fell back dead. The smell of human fat heavy in the air, and the flocks of sailors blown apart by direct hits so that not even the stench of their deaths was left to float in the air, created a kind of phantasmagoria. One of the first 2 bombs destroyed the compartment that housed the scopes for the air search radar, a devastating loss. Yamato's anti-aircraft fire remained without parallel in the Japanese Navy. Her remarkable agility allowed her to dodge torpedoes as if she were a much smaller ship. She fired her 18-inch guns into the sea, presumably to down low-flying torpedo planes with the massive waterspouts. Still, the number of planes and their pilots' skill unnerved the Japanese gunners. No fewer than 5 torpedoes struck the port side during the second wave. The invulnerable ship began listing to port as more bombs rained on her, causing enormous casualties. Even the near misses inflicted heavy damage. Their waterspouts were so fierce that they threatened to shatter metal high on the bridge. In the almost continuous attacks from 1300 to 1417 hours, the sailors lost track of the waves. The third one, of over 100 planes, arrived on the heels of the second and scored several direct bomb hits near the stack and 2 more torpedo hits, again port amidships. Not even the least sinkable ship could take infinite damage. The 6 torpedo hits on the port side caused serious flooding, despite 1,150 watertight compartments designed to prevent it. The list weakened morale and threatened fighting capability, which would be cut in half if it went to 5 degrees. Another ingenious engineering design allowed lists to be corrected by flooding the corresponding spaces on the opposite side. When the skipper ordered that measure, Ensign Yoshida immediately telephoned to warn the crews of the starboard boiler and engine rooms, but too late. Caught between the cold sea water rushing in and the steam of damaged boilers, several hundred men, who until that moment had made the ship go, battling sweltering heat amid deafening noise, uncomplaining throughout, were atomized. At the price of those several hundred lives, the ship's trim was nearly restored, but her speed and maneuverability were much reduced. Low in the water and moving slowly, Yamato was an increasingly easy target. The fourth wave, of over 150 planes, landed at least 10 more bombs topside and gouged out more of the port side with new torpedo hits. Her steering gear disabled, the ship was almost out of control. Still, professional officers marveled at the flying skill that made the American planes so different from practice targets. Yoshida noticed the flushed faces of the pilots bearing down on him one after another, their eyes opened wide or squeezed tight. Coming in again and again on the ideal approach, precisely, exactly, calmly, they evoke in us a sense of exhilaration, virtuosi. Theirs is a strength we can't divine, a force we cannot fathom. At the same time, Japanese officers were surprised that no pilot, even among the few who were hit, thought to crash his plane into the ship, kamikaze style. The once peerless vessel was a nightmare of desolation. Everything topside was a jumble of jagged steel and chunks of human flesh seared to blackened lumps. Torrents of the crew's blood washed body parts along the slanting deck. The convergence of torpedoes flooded the supposedly impregnable communications department. The watertight radio room had taken so much water that the ship had to rely entirely on light bankers and flag signals to communicate with her screen. Without radio capability, the giant vessel seemed to be disintegrating into separate parts while she floated in the water like a chunk of waterlogged wood. When the final attack began at 1400 hours, the list was so great that it exposed the starboard side of the vulnerable belly. Severe damage to the rudder ended all evasive action, making the ship a nearly stationary target for more torpedoes. 70 degrees of list, an incredible 80 degrees. Most ships sink at half that angle. 2 years earlier, undergraduate Yoshida seemed destined to join Japan's elite from Tokyo Imperial University, its chief training ground. Now the ensign watched his unsinkable giant ship writhe in torment, an ideal target for bombs, nothing more. Overwhelmed by fatigue, the living kept to their duty amid the fearful desolation until they joined the corpses strewn about them. To the living, Captain Arriga, renowned for his bravery, shouted, "Hold on, men! Hold on!" The encouragement of the burly, beloved gorilla, as he was nicknamed, did as much and as little as any display could. Since great Yamato's fate was certain, her amazing strength served only to prolong her agony. With the ship helpless and her anti-aircraft fire drastically reduced, the battle became a kind of exercise for the American planes. So many of the Fourth Wave's 386 were now circling above that they had to wait their turns for new runs, especially after rain squalls joined the low clouds to obscure the targets. Still, the enjoyment had its price. One Avenger's bombing run was so low that Yamato's final explosion set it afire. The pilot bailed out, and 2 PBM seaplanes that had been among the first to locate Task Force 2's position early that morning spotted his rubber raft. One served as a decoy for Japanese fire, while the other neatly landed to pluck the pilot from a seaweed of Japanese corpses and survivors. Those sailors and officers still able to see were dumbstruck by the American valor and pain to save an individual life. The rescue would be much written about, but seldom with a mention that the same crippled Avenger's 2 other crewmen had parachute trouble and drowned. If all men are equal in their Creator's eyes and families' hearts, the selection of those who are celebrated is as unfair as the tiny percentage who are chosen for combat during wartime and killed. But now there were thousands more unsung Japanese heroes than American, including Admiral Seiichi Ito. From his prestigious place on doomed Yamato's bridge, the force commander who had helped devise the strategy of the war's every important naval battle silently watched the destruction and carnage he'd foreseen when opposing the operation. Now he ordered it broken off and directed the surviving ships to return to port after rescuing the living from their disabled sisters. That order required great courage and resolve. Some senior officers in the group resented it bitterly, seeing cowardice in Ito's retreat from 100 million deaths rather than surrender. Perhaps his decision to abandon the operation at that final moment was an expression of, "I told you so." The Admiral shook hands with officers who crawled to him through the slanting deck's wreckage and pleaded to stay at his side. He issued a final order to save themselves and retired to his private quarters just under the bridge. His door did not open again. Universally admired Captain Arriga ordered all hands on deck. Even as the few still alive below struggled out of hatches, water cascaded into the openings, drowning others. Smoke too thick for flags to be seen required that the remaining destroyers be signalled by lamp to come alongside for removal of Yamato's survivors. But the destroyers kept their distance, fearing the great hulk would suck them to the bottom together with herself. Many of the living on the battleship did not want rescue in any case. Some bound themselves together to lessen the possibility of floating or involuntarily struggling to the surface. A sailor who volunteered to stand guard at the battle flag earned an equally proud death by clinging unwaveringly to the staff as the flag dipped below the waves. When Captain Arriga suddenly remembered the portraits of the Emperor and Empress that had pride of place in the senior wardroom, he was assured they would not suffer the unspeakable disgrace of being captured after floating to the surface. The officer in charge of the sacred images was guarding them in his quarters, his hatch locked from the inside. Arriga had no more wish to leave the ship than did Admiral Ito. To ensure that he wouldn't, he had a messenger, who could barely keep upright on the steeply slanting deck, slippery with blood, tie him to the binnacle in the anti-aircraft command post atop the bridge. The captain cried, "Long live the Emperor!" then awaited the end calmly eating biscuits, while a half-naked officer on deck stabbed the air with his sword and screamed, "Banzai!" at squads of enemy planes circling overhead, as if to symbolize the purpose of the mission and of continuing the war. After her 10 torpedo and 5 bomb hits and hundreds of near misses, the target with the list that now approached 90 degrees received the coup de grace from her own munitions. Before she capsized, shells stored in the magazines slipped from their positions and began knocking their fuses against bulkheads and overheads. Most of the 1,080 monsters for the main batteries, each 18.1 inches, hadn't been fired. They began detonating as the derelict rolled over and plunged toward her grave, thus ending 5 centuries of naval warfare based on competition between surface ships. The flash of light and 6,000-foot pillar of fire could be seen in Kagoshima, 200 miles distant. Thick umber smoke bubbled from the ocean and into a mushroom cloud almost 4 miles high. "The prettiest sight I've ever seen," noted a gunner in one of the American planes that had deftly disposed of the world's biggest and best battleship, just over 100 miles off the Kyushu coast. Although less passionate about offense over defense than the Imperial Army, the Navy favored speed and firepower over precaution and protection. For all Yamato's superb innovations, her medical facilities hadn't been designed to cope with heavy casualties. Most of the wounded had had to fend for themselves during the battle. Most still alive when the hulk went down were lost immediately. She carried no lifeboats or rafts. Those who managed not to be sucked down by the enormous weight of metal struggled in water heavy with oil as thick as melted caramels, and in many places on fire. Some sang to keep up their courage. Others went mad and consumed their last energy in wild thrashing. Hundreds choked and burned to death in the oil. Paradoxically, the enormous final explosion saved several dozen men by blowing them back to the surface from the hulk that was taking them to the bottom. The live-or-die margin was seconds here. Those blown up an instant too early, desperately gasping to relieve their bursting lungs, were sucked into the stack or killed by the explosion's downpour of fire and molten metal. Among the chosen providentially shot to the surface at the last instant before they drowned, Ensign Yoshida tried to help the wounded, but the explosion had been so great that he could find no debris large enough to make a raft. Several American planes made final strafing runs at the survivors struggling in the oil, some chanting the naval song. That begins, "If I go away to sea, I'll return a brine-soaked corpse." It was one of the rare times when gallantry lay with the Japanese, whose pilots often murdered Americans descending in parachutes, but had refrained from shooting at the survivors of Repulse and Prince of Wales. One by one, those who had hung on until now, even with their entrails curling into the water from gashes, began slipping under. The 3 surviving destroyers put boats over the side to salvage what they could of the human wreckage. The highest-ranking officer found alive, the admiral in command of the destroyer squadron, washed the oil from himself when pulled aboard, then wrote a signal to Combined Fleet Headquarters that he was headed for Okinawa. Operation Heaven No. 1 cost the American forces 12 flyers and 10 of their 386 planes, of which several, according to Yoshida, were lost when Yamato's final explosion engulfed them while they were circling to observe her end. It cost the Japanese 7 ships and 4,250 men, almost as many as the American Navy's entire losses of killed and missing in action would be at and around Okinawa, a toll itself far heavier than any previous naval campaign of the war. The attack on the light cruiser Yahagi, the largest of the screening ships, was second only to that on the main target. She took 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes before going down. Not one man on the destroyer Asashimo survived. Although a bomb to the engine room of the destroyer Kasumi, Spring Mist, mortally wounded her, half her crew transferred to Fuyutsuki, Winter Moon, which bravely rushed alongside to save them. Fuyutsuki was one of 4 destroyers that escaped sinking. After they returned to their bases the following day, the crews were put in a kind of quarantine for several weeks in an attempt to keep the debacle of Task Force 2 from the public. The same reception awaited some of Yamato's crew who survived the last American strafing, the 23 officers and 246 sailors of the complement of 3,332. It's often been written that the end of Yamato marked the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy, now but a glorious memory. Actually, a heavy cruiser and a destroyer would engage 5 Royal Navy destroyers the following month, and a submarine would sink the cruiser Indianapolis in July. Several other capital ships that remained intact would serve more as targets for American planes than as offensive threats. Except for aircraft and feeble anti-submarine efforts off the coasts of the home islands, the Navy would contribute nothing further of operational significance. Immobilized by lack of fuel, the handful of surviving capital ships rode at anchor under heavy camouflage near their bases, relegated to floating anti-aircraft batteries. In a final revenge for Pearl Harbor, as one historian called it, American planes sank them almost to the last, after which their officers and sailors prepared to join the defense of the home islands, although many knew it would be just as futile as the last spurt of glory on April 7th, after the loss of Okinawa. When the Emperor was informed of the destruction of Yamato and 5 of her escorts, he raised his hand to his temple and swayed in disbelief. "Gone?" he muttered. "She's gone?" When news reached Admiral Matome Ugaki, the commander of the 5th Air Fleet, which was mounting most of the kamikaze attacks on the American fleet off Okinawa, he noted in his diary that battleships were still needed for the day when "we resume the offensive," including a general offensive by the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa. When news reached General Mitsuru Ushijima, the commander of that 32nd Army, he snorted about the infernal waste and recalled that he'd advised the Navy against the adventure. "Banzai charges should be left to soldiers," he said. When Japanese soldiers on Okinawa were informed, by battleship Yamato-destroyed leaflets dropped from American planes, they admired the quality of the paper but guffawed in disbelief. A photograph of the sinking ship prompted some to scoff at the absurd measures American propagandists were taking to try to demoralize them. They, the fighting men in the field, knew Yamato could never be sunk any more than the Yamato people could be defeated. Like the sailors in Operation Heaven No. 1, those troops on Okinawa would often be committed to actions that were useless for any rational military purpose. The percentage killed in action there would be only slightly smaller than on the Yamato mission, although the full Japanese design would consume 3 months rather than an hour and a quarter. 2. American participants. A large honor roll dominated Main Street in Saugerties, a Hudson River town some 50 miles below Albany. Stalwarts' names were inscribed the moment they answered the call. The 1944 high school yearbook gave corresponding pride of place to photographs of graduates in uniform. Admiration also suffused Broom's, a hotel, restaurant and bowling alley whose clientele did not ordinarily ruminate about civic goals. George Broom kept a private honor roll of his warrior patrons over the fireplace of his saloon, and looked the other way when skinny, underage Dick Whittaker savoured the bar's company of local workers and servicemen on leave. The national outpouring of patriotism had sharpened the itch of Whittaker's friends to take up democracy's fight against her enemies. The 14-year-old himself yearned to join the boundless adventure of the Saugerties recruits already certified as heroes. He couldn't forget Pearl Harbor or Franklin Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech, which he heard with his parents on the radio in their modest living room. About the new enemy, he knew only that the sneaky Japanese bought lots of scrap and made cheap copies of American artifacts. But he hoped Roosevelt's outrage over their treachery might somehow speed him into the fighting. As tanks seemed a natural step up from tantalizing cars, war was an exciting progression from the best action movies. The budding valiant in the world's finest cause went on to enlist in the Marines at the age of 17, but his father refused to sign the papers. So it was back to time-wasting high school. Despite his father's reduction to part-time work during the Depression, life in Saugerties and in the creek-filled countryside, perfect for fishing in summer, hockey in winter, was fine for a lad who loved the outdoors. Still, he couldn't be entirely happy. He was aging, and wars didn't last forever. His luck changed when he graduated from high school in June 1944, 9 months before Yamato's final mission. Drafted immediately, the just-turned 18-year-old took a bus to Albany to join a long line of fellow draftees, shuffling slowly toward an Army induction counter in a post office, until he was recognized by the Marine recruiter who'd arranged his vetoed enlistment the previous year. "Hey, Mac, still want the Marines?" Avid Dick did indeed, and so did the boy with him, an acquaintance from near Saugerties. The sergeant motioned them out of the line. Sworn back into the Marines, Whittaker boarded a train for his great adventure. The Marine Corps' East Coast boot camp was on Paris Island, 50 miles below Charleston, South Carolina. Heads were shaved and dignity stripped instantly. Every last recruit was a worthless nothing. "You are not Marines! You are civilians! You're the dregs!" Many ardent boys deeply regretted their decision before the first sunset. The training was dehumanizing as well as harsh. Its purpose was to undo everything the recruits had believed about themselves and reconstruct them mentally and emotionally as well as physically, to make them into Marines, the best fighters in the world. That belief was crucial. The best in the world would never let a buddy down no matter how deadly the enemy fire. The dregs could be made the best only by stripping away their individual egos and reassembling the remains as interchangeable members of fighting units. In body-strong young men, the recruits were emotionally still boys, necessary for their remaking into unquestioning fulfillers of every order. Who else would feel compelled to undertake combat's otherwise mad acts, such as running up Okinawan hills honeycombed with Japanese gun emplacements? Only total indoctrinates in the glorious traditions they had to uphold would leave their cover to attack the enemy's murderous positions. No living person had impressed most recruits, or ever would, as much as their amazingly tyrannical drill instructors. "Hey you, move your head again in ranks and I'll boot you that you'll have to unbutton your collar for your farts." Whittaker sometimes wondered whether the drill instructors were trying to kill the 80 members of his platoon, 452. When they incurred the milder wrath of their chief DI, a sergeant named Blackburn, he ordered them to place their scrubbing buckets over their heads and sing the Marine Corps hymn. Bellowing into that curious headgear, they couldn't hear him stalking the ranks. "Louder, you half-ass bunch of civilian scumbags! Louder!" Anyone perceived as not shouting beyond the top of his lungs received a swagger stick's deafening whack on his bucket. Many singing more thunderously than they had believed possible got the whack anyway. Punishment was administered to the entire bone-weary platoon for individual members' seemingly insignificant errors. In combat, the enemy would seek the single weak link to break the chain. The slightest slip-up would jeopardize the dozens or hundreds who got it right. The recruits didn't yet understand they were being molded, brainwashed, never to let the unit down in the slightest little anything. Each would have to be able to count utterly on every one of the others. Platoon 452 grew smaller. Better to learn on the drill fields that not all were cut out to be Marines than in a foxhole under attack in the dark of night. Relentless physical hardening was the least of it for hardy specimens raised on outdoor labour or athletic conditioning, as a majority were. Learning how to kill took finer training. Marine Corps hype aside, the callow youths were made into excellent riflemen. Endlessly field stripping and reassembling their M1S blindfolded, they came to know them far better than their own bodies. The carbine, Browning automatic rifle, and several varieties of machine guns were also taught, but it was in use of the piece that they had to become maestros. Piece was obligatory nomenclature. Any dog-tired unfortunate who called his M1 a gun was awarded extra hours of a testicle-centered drill that would keep him from ever repeating that mistake. They learned to compensate for range when there was no time to adjust their sights. They became practiced in the art of Kentucky windage, making instant allowance for wind at various ranges. Every recruit became confident of being able to hit a head or chest at 100 yards without kneeling or propping the piece against a support, which gave consistent accuracy at even greater distances. Should his ammunition run out, he knew how to kill quickly with his bayonet. The men of Platoon 452 graduated knowing they were damn good because that was what the Corps had made them. The grueling test passed together would link them forever, partly in contempt of lesser men, partly in trust that all other Marines would respond as instantly and unquestioningly to every order. None would let the Corps down because no Marine ever did. Let no mother ever say her son died in combat for lack of training, decreed a big Paris Island sign. Wondering why fathers had been left out, Whitaker felt certain neither parent would ever say that about him. Boot camp's overriding lesson, the purpose for the proficiency with weapons, utter reliability under extreme stress, and esprit de corps that would conquer fear of death, was how to close with the enemy and kill him, which the new Marines felt proud to have mastered. After Edmund DeMar's father, a Brooklyn truck driver, lost his job during the Depression, the family left for humbler quarters in a Connecticut town. Ed quit school, did even smaller odd jobs than his father, and, with a few dollars earned cleaning up the mess of the 1938 hurricane, took off for Miami with friends in an old Plymouth. The 19-year-olds arrived with a nickel each. Back down to 1 nickel again 2 chancy years later, DeMar saw a Marine in dress blues promising adventure on a post office poster. On his way to his physical in Savannah, he told himself that at least he'd be partway back to Connecticut if he failed. The entry point for Paris Island was a profoundly hick town called Yamasee. When DeMar stepped off the bus there, a drill instructor was waiting. A fellow recruit extended his hand and politely introduced himself, in response to which the DI slapped him hard in the face. "I don't give a goddamn what your name is. You're a weakling, a nothing." DeMar considered getting back on the bus. 15 months later, the boot camp graduate was back in Florida, now the corporal of the guard at a naval air station, when a jeep raced toward him, breaking the base speed limit and the Sunday peacetime slumber. "The Japanese!" bellowed the driver. "Corporal DeMar, the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor." "The Japanese," DeMar responded. "Where's Pearl Harbor?" On Okinawa, he'd be among the few pre-war regulars, and, at the age of 26, one of the Fighting Marines' older enlisted men. On the American side, it would never be more true than in the Pacific War's hardest encounter that wars made by older generations are fought by younger ones. Thomas Hanaher's father was born in the Dakota Territory. The boy's body didn't accommodate his yearning to impress the girls with athletic feats. While his high school friends were entering various services, he, a freshman at North Dakota State, was classified 4F. The unlucky 18-year-old's second stab at joining the fighting men brought him up against the same medical captain who'd uncovered his asthma during his humiliating first examination. "What are you doing back here?" the doctor asked. "Because the colonel over there said I was okay," the ordinarily upright boy mouthed the instant lie that had somehow come to him. When the captain chose not to dispute his superior, Hanaher was in, and chose the Marines at the end of his final line. "Why'd you do that?" "Are you trying to commit kamikaze?" asked a friend determined to stay with the army. Far from hero material, the unathletic Hanaher had never even fired a gun, something almost a little odd in the Dakotas. His choice of the Corps made no sense at all, except in terms of his old desire to prove himself, for which he'd soon curse himself, for he hated where it took him. First, there was boot camp, a terrible experience for someone just out of high school who had been living at home in a quiet small-town community. Boot camp was being treated like a criminal. It was like I had broken a law by joining the Marines and had been sent to reform school. But one of the war's million ironies would put him among the few Marines unwounded during the entire Okinawan campaign, whereas his more cautious army friend would be blown to bits during the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium. Pearl Harbor prompted John D. Rockefeller Jr. to prudent calculation of the danger of Axis bombs. Rockefeller, one of the 5 sons of the original John D., decided to relocate himself and his Park Avenue apartments' art treasures to his country estate. Joseph Bangert's family moved with him to Tarrytown, New York, for young Joe's father was one of 5 drivers who served John D. Jr., S branch of the family. The boss bickered with them over such matters as their laundry bills when they were on the road for him. Bangert once heard his father argue with Rockefeller over an expense item of a dime. Fearless Joe was the youngest and wildest of 11 Bangert boys, 4 of whom were overseas in various services by 1943. That was when the 16-year-old black sheep of the family, itching to do something other than screw up in school, enlisted in the Navy. The self-confessed smartass and hellraiser was directed to report again after he turned 17, this time with his parents' consent. He bamboozled it by slipping in the form with others required for playing high school football. With no medics of their own, combat Marines were assigned Navy corpsmen. Bangert took his first step toward that hazardous work at his induction when he was told of a pressing need for medical corpsmen, who were automatically promoted to second-class seamen with a pay of $54 a month instead of $50 for third class. After boot camp and corpsman training, he was assigned to a California naval hospital, where he took his second step toward action in the field. An unsatisfactory inspection of some spaces for which he was responsible fired the wrath of his officer, a fastidious nurse. "Are you through?" the second-class corpsman dared to ask the ensign after her harangue. "No!" she screamed, and resumed castigating until she ran out of breath. "Now are you through?" Bangert repeated. "Yes, I'm through." "Then take this," said the smartass, gripping a broom handle, "and shove it up your Gigi." Given the Corps' great shortage of hands to tend the mounting number of wounded on the Pacific Islands, his previous request for assignment to combat duty was now not to be denied. Marines reached Okinawa in a variety of ways. A minority came from previous island battles after intervals of rest and rehabilitation. Others were graduates of more specialized schools, from which they were shipped to the Pacific. What almost all had in common, apart from their spirited training, was patriotic zeal. Lenley Cotton, the son of separated parents, then a rare disgrace, managed to fool the examiners and enlist at 16, but his first duty on the Aleutian Islands disappointed him because there were no Japanese soldiers to kill. You wanted combat because that's what you were trained for from the first day in boot camp. All those months preparing to fight got to you. You wanted to do it. Back in the States at 18, Cotton knew replacement troops for Iwo Jima's combat were so badly needed that anyone caught AWOL was shipped there immediately. But since he was on the East Coast and would probably go to Europe, where Germany was almost finished, he hitchhiked west, careful to avoid military police patrols until he'd crossed the Mississippi, then gave himself up. "I knew I'd get sent straight to the Pacific from there. My only worry was that the war would be over before I could get there and be a hero." The invading force would be made up of over 500,000 Americans. No more than a handful had any real knowledge of Japan. Whitaker knew absolutely nothing until the sneak attack onto Pearl. If I had any impression of Japanese at all, another Marine would remember, it was that they were funny little people walking around in kimonos. Fred Popper loved sailing and volunteered for the Navy, but flat feet and astigmatism excluded him from all programs leading to a commission. Now he was a quartermaster third class on a brand new landing craft converted to a floating rocket launcher. Sometimes my buddies and I would cry when presenting arms to the flag. Actually cry, because of American goodness and virtuousness, all so beautiful and pure. About Okinawa they knew nothing whatever. Most would hear their first something aboard troop ships bearing them there. While Dick Whittaker was downing his pre-induction beers in brooms, Tadashi Kojo was practicing the martial art of kendo across the Usuri River from Siberia. Stationed in the bleak barracks settlement of Nishitoan, Kojo's 22nd Regiment of the Japanese 24th Infantry Division lived on hot resolve to crush the hated Russians. The proud regiment was guarding Manchuria, the jewel of the empire. After victory in the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, Tokyo claimed the Liaotung Peninsula, convinced heart and soul that the relatively small tract, tipped by Port Arthur, was among its just spoils. When Japan was forced to back down, patriots vowed to endure any privation, to lie on kindling wood and lick gall, to get back their own. The humiliating retreat was coerced by France, Germany and Russia, their own appetites upset by the Japanese aspiration to join their table of Asian snacks. In particular, the Russians were determined to keep Tokyo from establishing a power base in resource-rich Manchuria. Ever since Japan's deep isolation had ended in 1853, the poor, technologically backward nation worked sacrificially to industrialize and militarize in the pattern of her economic betters in the West. But instead of being welcomed into the imperialist club, as the Japanese naively hoped to be, they were given to know they were of the wrong race. Memories of those insults remained fresh that June of 1944. The 22nd Regiment's officers revered the army for its part in defeating the arrogant Russians in the War of 1905, a victory that astonished the West, which had taken for granted the Great Bear would maul the little yellow upstart. A mere 50 years after her 1853 opening, feudal agricultural Nippon mustered the astonishing effort to make herself at least partially industrialized, the proof of which was her defeat of a European power. But although that dressed her wounded honour with a rich balm, the country remained as sensitive as ever to others' snubs. The army restored more national honour in 1931 by taking not merely the stolen Liaotung Peninsula, but all of Manchuria as well, to wild cheers at home. With a soaring population, scanty raw materials, and a depression-crippled economy, most Japanese believed Manchuria was vital to the nation's survival. And although the country, renamed Manchukuo and ruled by a puppet government, had been a de facto colony for 13 years, they remained convinced Russia still had evil designs on it. That was why the venerable, distinguished 22nd Regiment now kept unblinking watch on Soviet detachments across the river. Yes, the war with America was important, but the regiment's officers still saw their chief enemy in Japan's old, rapacious competitor for Manchuria, which the great deceiver Stalin might well attack at any moment, despite the non-invasion pact with Moscow. Actually, the senior officers were confident they themselves would do the attacking. The regiment trained relentlessly for an undeclared night strike across the river and through the Soviet marshes on the other side. Avid for the opportunity, the officers, overachievers in training as in so much else, kept their troops poised and ready. The isolation helped. The soldiers' chief relief from their stark living conditions were prostitutes, some seized from Korea, another protectorate. Bullying non-commissioned officers went up and down the ranks, bashing faces. No one laughed when superiors had to stand on tiptoe to reach those of the tallest. The recipients learned to clench their teeth to keep them intact. Some toppled over, dazed and bleeding. They were hardly the first or last cannon fodder to be both miserably treated and utterly loyal. As in other countries gripped by feudalistic patriotism, there may even have been a correlation between wretched treatment and devotion to the beloved homeland. The emperor inspired awe and adoration. Although the barracks were full of whispered complaints against individual sadists, There was virtually no questioning of the Empire's uniqueness, rightness, and mission, or of the duty to suffer and die for them. Tokyo's leading newspapers explained why. All came to instant, unbreathing attention when the emperor was mentioned, as during the frequent readings of the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, a document that predated the much less relevant and, for officers, less important constitution. The fundamental rules and philosophy set forth in that self-described grand way of heaven and earth and universal law of humanity had to be flawlessly memorized. A recruit bound for Okinawa that June, who'd taken basic training at about the same time as Dick Whittaker on Paris Island, watched fellow recruits being beaten bloody for the tiniest mistake reciting the rescript's stilted, archaic phrases. Much more minor infractions also earned blows, often to all members of the units involved. Although the drive to establish collective responsibility had its parallel in American basic training, Japanese intentions differed tellingly. Bruised quarry who tried to supply a reason when asked why they were being hit were hit even harder. The point was that they weren't supposed to know the reason because their duty was never to think. A native psychologist would conclude shortly after the war that the violence was used in order to implant the idea of absolute obedience, which was grounded in a lack of all thought, right or wrong. Sometimes it wasn't a matter of obeying or disobeying. A soldier who'd fight opposite Dick Whittaker on the Okinawan hill nicknamed Sugarloaf would remember. I was beaten for no justifiable reason and quite unexpectedly. I was hit almost every evening as a recruit, another infantryman on Sugarloaf would remember. Utter obedience was demanded. If I was shown a piece of black paper and told it was white, I'd have to agree. Another remembered being slapped every evening for nothing. When he actually committed a slip-up, forgetting to hang his string-strung purse from his neck, a senior private whacked his face with an old shoe. Much later, another Japanese psychologist would dot the I of explanation for such behavior in a determination to instill complete submissiveness. Subjecting young men to fear of violent punishment quickly transformed them into monsters of self-abasement, humiliation, and shrewdness. Many recruits who'd be shipped to Okinawa lived in constant fear of blows for a bad attitude, which also meant for nothing. One man lost so much weight that doctors grew concerned during a rare physical and ordered a ration of 5 eggs a week, all instantly confiscated by the veteran soldiers who administered the beatings. One day his unit was told to jot down their candid thoughts about army life. "Being neither cats nor dogs, we'd like to be treated like human beings," he wrote naively, and was beaten even more severely. Fighting units like the 22nd Regiment conducted their own basic training, permitting non-commissioned officers to establish their tyranny from the start. The word of a superior even one grade up was likened to an imperial order, giving non-coms the authority to warn that disobedience to them, even of an order to scrub latrines, was tantamount to disobedience to the emperor himself. Such arrangements were much less onerous to Japanese soldiers than they would have been to American, for their upbringing was rooted in emperor worship and a caste system based on strict submission. Conformity, discipline, hierarchy, loyalty, duty, and obedience were paramount in Japanese civilian life. The notions of individual rights and challenge to authority were remote to those whose earliest lessons focused on complying with group expectations, in a culture where nonconformist behavior earned instant condemnation. Pre-war Japan was so locked into hard work and instinctive bows to seniority and authority, and the belief that perseverance and endurance of suffering were among the most desirable qualities, that army life, even in its tormenting first year, actually represented liberation to some. In 1933, 14-year-old Kuniichi Izuchi, whose artillery battery would be annihilated on Okinawa, travelled to the ancient capital of Kyoto to be apprenticed to a respected painter. During the next 5 years, little Kuniichi's hands permanently ached from chilblains caused by scrubbing his master's floor with water that often froze in winter. He knew his relatively kind master liked him. His blows for not doing exactly as he was told were simply part of the accepted approach to training. Lessons were to be literally beaten into the pupil's head, in a favoured Japanese expression. In addition to the cleaning, which lasted into the night, the boy looked after the master's children and saw to 100 household chores, without a single painting lesson during the full first year. Although Kyoto was but an hour away from his village by train, Izuchi endured 4 additional years of heavy toil and severe discipline without once going home to visit, despite his longing to indulge in that impermissible weakness. By the time he took basic training with his regiment, military discipline was a snap for him, and although he rated his chances of surviving the American war at no more than 20%, the confidence that everyone would do his job as told assured him Japan would win. Still, army life was sufficiently grimmer than the grinding apprenticeships to make many non-professional soldiers dream of returning home. The grueling physical training included cold endurance marches in winter and heat endurance in summer, both to physical limits. And beyond, casualties were frequent. A Western expert before the war witnessed fortitude little short of phenomenal. Rooted out of bed in the dead of night, soldiers were ordered to don huge packs and keep going no matter what. The purpose was to build stoical disregard of pain and exhaustion. "Why don't you let them sleep?" a British observer asked during a 48-hour marathon. The training officer's answer came almost before the question left his mouth. They already know how to sleep. There were no radios or movies on Tadashi Kojo's base in desolate Nishi-Toan. Day after day of bayonet practice served for sport. Bayonet charges also helped stress the supreme importance of attack. Officers relentlessly instructed their units that they could defeat the enemy only by disregarding all thought of their own lives, and by taking the offensive that had served so well from the Sino-Japanese Wars to the Russo-Japanese War to Pearl Harbor and Singapore. True grit helped make the Japanese soldier the country's supreme weapon, as promised by a manual issued to all recruits upon entering the army. Regular army field officers saw that opportunity to strike the first vital blow as the full purpose of their lives. Those of the 22nd Regiment practiced kendo religiously. Evenings they drank sake and discussed tactics, troop training, and preparing for the all-important Staff College examination. Boyish-looking Kojo himself, who was as tough as nails and as single-minded as prescribed, was a stickler for rules. The scrupulous 23-year-old captain never hit his men, leaving that to his non-coms. He merely rapped his junior officers with his riding crop on occasion, and they, in turn, slapped their men's faces. The men admired and feared their dashing battalion commander. Mistakes triggered his short temper. Arrogance was part of regular officers' professionalism. In Kojo's case, it drew on patrician social stature. Almost 1,000 years earlier, an important Japanese clan sent a young samurai to put down new roots in a remote southern frontier called Satsuma. Samurai, probably from a verb meaning to serve, originally referred to a member of the sovereign's guard, and later extended to high-ranking warriors privileged to ride a horse. After the youth became a minor feudal lord, one of his sons was given the name Kojo, small castle. The family's prominence endured in Tadashi's youth, when his grandmother acknowledged neighbours' deep bows with her own much shallower one. The clinic of his father, a distinguished surgeon who'd interned in progressive Nagasaki, had one of the prefecture's 2 X-ray machines, the other belonging to the major hospital. Even caring for his poorest patients without charge, he earned more than the prefectural governor, and was so keen on education that he sent a daughter to Tokyo to study, which was almost unheard of, especially in poor, backward Satsuma. The affluent parents tried to keep their 2 daughters and 6 sons to the frugality more expected in Spartan Satsuma than elsewhere in Japan. But Tadashi's father, who saw more than 100 patients a day and devoured medical journals when not attending professional conferences in Tokyo, lacked time to apply the strict discipline also admired in that province. His loving mother, the highly cultured daughter of a rich Nagasaki businessman, devoted herself to her children. Uncommonly free of rules and with positively indulgent exposure, by Satsuma's standards, to cosmopolitan influences, Tadashi climbed nearby mountains, swam in the local river, and rowed boats in Kagoshima Bay. Although most samurai legal privileges had been officially abolished in 1873, 20 years after the country's isolation ended, Satsuma schools still instilled the old ways of hierarchy, obedience, and stringent service, and pointedly favoured the samurai boys. Tadashi often postponed studying for reading, his love of which prompted thoughts of a literary career. But samurai boys were constantly exhorted to prepare for the life of few words and valorous deeds that characterized real Satsuma men. Partly out of warrior tradition, partly because the narrow Satsuma childhood retarded education for other professions, many top pupils applied for the military academies, which the ardently patriotic director of Tadashi's school urged also for him, an excellent if erratic pupil. After all, army officers were a national elite as well as provincial heroes. Most of Japan's prime ministers had been generals. Tadashi's parents championed medicine, pointing out that an army doctor would have the best of two worlds. But rare as it was in Satsuma, they left the decision to their boy, who now wanted to be a real soldier. Entrance to the Imperial Military Academy, Shikan Gakko, remained extremely competitive in the mid-1930s, even while the academy was greatly expanding for Japan's deeper involvement in war. But Kojo easily passed the entrance exam and matriculated in 1937 at the age of 17. During his years there, Japan loathed the Western powers less than it later would, partly because confidence remained high during the army's thrashing of China. Still, every youth received stiff daily doses of jingoism. The quick, happy gobbling of Manchuria had sharpened appetites. Further expansion was seen as the only answer to the depression-caused collapse of Western markets and the doubling of the Japanese population in 50 years. The few who challenged the growing passion for military power were labelled hikoku min, non-citizens, and accused of endangering national security. Weaving a hold on the country of the samurai spirit and group mentality, prophets of national and self-fulfillment through conquest won more concessions the more violent they became. The super-patriots excited poor peasants who yearned for better conditions for themselves and glory for their nation, and lacked all notion of the wretchedness that their aspirations caused other peoples. The most determined used intimidation and assassination to silence disapproving liberals and moderates. Especially after they yanked the country into war with China in 1937, the year Kojo became a cadet, their imperial way extremism established the national climate. "War is the father of creativeness and the mother of culture," began an army pamphlet published 3 years earlier. The population of Kojo's rugged native Satsuma, which had been renamed Kagoshima Prefecture after its main city, remained top-heavy with samurai who felt superfluous in civilian life and happy for the national turn toward their soldierly outlook. Even the influence of Kojo's rich, relatively worldly parents didn't shake his acceptance of the axiom that the highest service was military. Having absorbed some of the academy's surging, unqualified love for the army as the source of supreme honor and good, Cadet Kojo became convinced that sacrifice for emperor and country was life's finest fulfillment. The academy's curriculum was squeezed from 4 to 3 years as enrollment rapidly increased. Whole pages of its textbooks were crossed out, and those texts concerned military matters almost entirely. Shikan Gakko more resembled a superior officers' training school than it did West Point, which then offered science and humanities courses similar to those of ordinary colleges. All movies and plays, even Japanese, were forbidden, even on holidays. Most cadets were bright boys from poor farm families, very grateful for their chance to escape poverty while serving the nation. The few who had indulged in the dangerous distractions of non-military interests were cured. It was an article of faith that any thought unrelated to training and fighting could only dull an officer's edge. After the war, Kojo would realize that far from contributing to the army's strength, the prized narrowness implanted a fatal weakness. But Cadet Kojo would not have believed that the Imperial Academy was actually training officers to be blind to critical realities. And just as the Academy staff prided itself on having no background knowledge to consider anything non-military, The High Command was proud of its indifference to such political and economic factors as America's will to fight the costly war. It taught that discipline, field tactics, skill with arms, and inculcation of the crucial, indomitable Japanese spirit would destroy all enemies. Kojo was less than a zealous student. While others awoke before reveille, leaping out of bed for a running start on morning duties, he slept until the last possible moment. The teenager missed his family's luxurious warmth and regretted that no book other than military texts and training manuals could be opened without permission. But in time, the restriction seemed natural. Then it became natural not to want permission. Although sometimes so tired that he dozed in class, his face swollen from slaps for minor infractions, he became immensely grateful for his destiny. Privilege was merging with the unswerving elite of regular officers and their noble cause, their inspiration to strive for supreme integrity and unselfish loyalty, together with their contempt for outside interests. The Emperor conferred a blessing on the academy by attending its graduation ceremonies.